All right, we are on our live stream. Let's put this in a few places. All right, there's one. Bear with me momentarily. I'm having a little problem getting one of these shares out. Again, just bear with me 1 minute. We've got just a little bit of a hang up getting this put where it needs to be. All right. Give me 1 second. All right, we may not be on our page tonight, and if we're not, I apologize for that. We're having some issues. We'll try to get that shared there a little later. I think most people watch it through our other groups, but I'm not having any luck there, and we need to get started with class. So again, apologize for that. Let's get started. Let me get back here. Get everything, check everything. Yep, everything's situated. All right, we are tonight in Exodus 20. We have been studying through the book of Exodus. We have been looking at these different things that have happened in the book of Exodus. We have followed Israel. We followed them again from the story of Genesis all the way through to Joseph in Egypt, and we talked about their slavery, the Exodus, leaving their slavery and coming into Sinai. We talked last week. Mary talked about them coming to the foot of the mountain, and as they come to the foot of the mountain. And as they come to the foot of the mountain, you remember God told them not to touch the mountain, not to get up on it, that it will be the smoke and the fire and all that would hinder them from entering the mountain. And if they touched the mountain, they were to be struck down. And God spoke to them and basically spoke to Moses, but spoke to the people. And in doing so, he established a covenant of asking the people, do you enter into this agreement? Will you take his law and take his word and follow him? And that's what they do in that chapter. And we continue that in this chapter, in chapter 20. Exodus 20 is a very interesting chapter, and we're going to sort of change the style of what we've been in classes for a while, because up till chapter 20, the first 19 chapters of Exodus have been narrative. It's been telling a story. Beginning in chapter 20 and following through the end of this book, we're going to see a change from narrative into law giving, and we're going to talk about those laws. We're going to talk about how they are. We're not going to spend as much time on these. So tonight we're only going to get one chapter, but in the weeks to come, we may get further than one chapter a week. So I'm just giving you a heads up, because sometimes when we read these laws, they're self-explanatory, and some of them we won't have to talk about as much as maybe others. But I want us to look at these, because these are the ones that lays the foundation. This is the beginning of God and his dealing with Israel in a formal sense and in a formal manner. So we begin in Exodus 20, verse 1. And it said, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Now, what this is the beginning of these words, and this is God speaking to Israel, and he is setting up a covenant. And remember, covenant is another word for what we may relate to more to a contract. A contract between two parties. And this was a typical contract we're going to see. This was typically a contract that was seen between two kings. And typically the way this contract is laid out, you'll see the contract with a greater king and a lesser king. There'll be a vassal king and then a clientele king. What that means is that there would be certain nations where a vassal king was in charge. They would conquer another nation, but instead of putting another ruler in their place, they would leave the ruler that was there in place, or put a ruler that from the area in place, and then they would make a covenant with them, a treaty or a contract. And the greater king would lay out his greater abilities, and then he would dictate laws to that lower king of what he was expected to do. And if he failed to do it, what would happen to him? That's sort of what we see here. Not sort of, it is what we see here, in that God speaks to Israel. And the idea here, again, is that God speaks as the one with all the power. There's no hint, there's no idea, no even glimpse given that Israel has any power, any authority in any of these going on. They are subject to God. And the reason for that is because God is the one who has all the power. And God is the one who has done all these things. And therefore, we begin in verse 2, where he says, I am the Lord your God. I am the Lord. And again, that Lord is the name Yahweh. I am Yahweh, your God. And then he talks about what he's done. I am the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And so he lays out this covenant, begin by speaking who he is and his role in this covenant. And then he's going to go from there to talk about what this covenant is. And we're going to get into the Ten Commandments. Now, the interesting thing about this is that in Jewish thinking, in certain Jewish areas, the Ten Commandments, this is sometimes viewed by the Jews especially as being the first commandment. The first commandment is that I am the Lord your God. You'll see there's three main ideas about the Ten Commandments. All of them say there's 10, but they're divided on what the 10 are. What happens is that the Jews, for instance, Judaism says that I'm the Lord your God is the first commandment. Now, exactly how that works, the commandment, they explain it, but I don't have time to explain it here. And then what we consider the first and second commandment, they consider one commandment together. They consider it the second commandment and go on through. Another way of doing this is the Catholic style of doing this. The Catholics take the Ten Commandments and they change them up a little bit in that they take not this as the first one, but they take the first one that we have. They take the first two that we typically view as, and they take those as one, the first, and then the 10th commandment, they break it into half. They break it into two ideas of coveting. And some have said they do that to downplay the second commandment, which is not having graven idols or carved images before God. But there's different ways of breaking it down. But typically, this is what we may call the preamble. This is the introduction of God laying out who he is, and then he's going to tell the people what he expects of them. And of these next 10 commandments, the way we typically look at them, 8 of the 10 are negative. 8 of the 10 are you shall not. And the other interesting thing about this is that this you here, we talked about this before, that if the Hebrew has a plural you and a singular you. We talked about how sometimes they use that plural you, and it can be misleading to us English readers. What's interesting about this chapter and these words is that when we would probably expect him to use the plural you, he uses singular you. And I think God does that for a reason, to show that this this covenant, these commandments are not necessarily just for the nation, but they're for each individual Jew. Each individual Jew has a responsibility, has a part that they are to uphold. And so they give the eight, again, 8 of these commandments are in the negative, you shall not, 2 are positive. 2 that are positive are honor your father and mother and remember the Sabbath. And we'll talk about those as we get there. But let's start and let's look at these 10 commandments. The first one is very simple, very straightforward. That's the idea that this 10 commandments is also sometimes called the Decalogue. And they get that from a Greek word that the Septuagint used. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, and it calls the 10 Commandments the Decalogue, which means 10 words. And some of these words, a matter of what's interesting, some of these commandments in the Hebrew are 2 words. And so these are very concise, very succinct statements of God. And that's what we're going to see. This is the foundation that the rest of the law is really going to flesh out. And so he starts out here, you shall have no other gods before me. The idea here of this, you shall have no other gods before me, gives another idea that before me does not mean that you can have other gods as long as God is number one. Some have tried to say that. Some have tried to say throughout history, oh, well, you can worship God, but you can worship other gods. As long as you put the Yahweh God as number one, you can serve him, and then you can serve these other gods, but just realize God is above those. No. And some have said that when he talks about being God of gods and Lord of lords. But when those statements are stated, they're not to say that he's the head of the rest of them. The idea here is no other gods before me, is to have no other gods but me, no other gods beside me. Is his statement. There is to be no other gods to worship. And these first 2 commandments really deal with that idea of their service to God, because the second one is you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or that is in the earth beneath or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. So notice the second one of these commandments is that you shall not make for yourself the carved image. Now, you shall not make for yourself a graven image is what the King James here will say. And the idea that carved image is the thought that all their idols would have been made either from wood or from stone or gold. And what you'd have to do is you'd have to form that idol. And that's the idea. You shall not have a formed image. You're not to have something you see to worship. And I want to stop here for a second, because we as 21st century Christians miss this idea. This was a radical, revolutionary teaching of God, to not have an idol, to not have an image that's worshiped. And again, I say it's odd to us because we don't associate that. But when you look at every other religion that has been in the world, every other religion that was at this time, even some religions today, some of those the more pagan, multi-god religions, one of their key foundations, one of their key things they talk about over and over again is that they have these carved images. You have an image, you worship. All the gods of Egypt, they had an image. They had a statue. They had a wooden carving. They had a metal. They had stone. They had something that you would go in and see, and you would bow down before this thing. The Greeks did it. The Romans did it. All throughout history, people have built these idols and built these things to worship. Even today in those countries that still worship these things, such as Africa, you'll see this in the Middle East, in certain areas that worship these other gods. They'll have these carved images, and God says, no. God says, don't have any of those. There is no representation of me. And that's the idea that God is saying that he is above that. He cannot be represented, because notice what he says. He says, don't create anything that's in heaven above. Don't create anything on earth, or don't create anything in the water. There's no, what he's basically saying is there's no creature on earth, no thing on earth that you can associate with God. And this was unusual to them. And then you notice it says, you shall not bow down to them or serve them. Then he says, for I'm a jealous God. That, well, he says, when you make an idol, when you create an idol, and you create something that you think looks like me, and you begin to worship that idol, what happens is that not only is that idol worship, but also the animals associated with that idol is worship, such as India does this. When India, the cow is sacred to India. Well, it's because one of their gods looks like a cow. To the Egyptians, the cat was a sacred animal. Well, it's because one of their gods looked like a cat. And God says, no, you're not going to worship these idols. You're not going to worship these idols. You're not going to worship the animals these idols are made of. He says, because I am a jealous God. I am a God that, again, is jealous in the way not of petty jealousy, but some have described this probably as saying that I'm a jealous God as a husband ought to be jealous. And the idea is that a husband ought to be jealous for his wife. A husband ought to do anything he can to keep anybody from infringing on his wife, and that's what God does. God is that jealous husband that refuses to let his wife be tempted, refuses to let his wife be drawn away by another God. And this is what God says, I'm a jealous God. I am that God that wants full attention. And again, this is not bad. Then he goes on to give us another part of God that is sometimes frightening to us. And again, this may be something we don't always think about, where he says that I am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Now, we may look at that and say, now how does this line up? Because we know God says that here, but in other places, God says that he the son is not guilty of the iniquity of the father, that each person is guilty of their own sins. They're not inherited sins. So how do you line these two up? Well, what God says here is not that he's going to cause the sin to be on that person, but the consequences of their sin can go throughout generations. And we've seen that, haven't we? Have you ever seen someone who acts in a sinful way and their consequences not only affect them, but their children and grandchildren, or maybe their parents and grandparents, that it affects their whole family? Maybe you have someone who does something so heinous that for the rest of their life in their area, they are looked down upon. That name is a vile name, even to be kin to that person. That's the idea, is God is speaking here of the consequences of sin. That some of the consequences of those who hate him could be seen in the third and fourth generation, meaning that God is not one to offend. God is not one to have him turn against you. When he turns against you, it's not going to be pleasant. But the other side of that is we need to also reflect on verse 6. The flip side of that is that in the flip side, he shows mercy, steadfast love. Now, he shows steadfast love to thousands of those who love him and keep his commandments. So God says that he remembers the iniquity of a father, the family, down to the third and fourth generations, meaning that when they sin and God decides to punish that sin, the consequences can be seen for generations. That's how jealous God is. That's how true God is when you disobey him. These are the consequences. The flip side is also true in that God's mercy is even greater. Notice that affects a family. He says over here, it affects thousands. The thousands who come to him, who love him and keep his commandments. And so God lays out very simply that God is a jealous God. He's a God that doesn't want to share their attention. He is a jealous husband that expects the attention of his spiritual wife. He goes from there to the third commandment. The third commandment is, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Now, this commandment is very interesting because there's been a few different ways of people taking this and maybe trying to go beyond what God had originally said and God originally meant. One is today, you hear people talk about you break this command if you use God's name in curse words. And again, I'm not trying to say that's a good thing, but I don't think that's necessarily what this commandment is talking about. It's not talking about using God's name in that fashion. Another misconception about this is the Jews. The Jews throughout history, it's very interesting because the Jews quit pronouncing God's name. God, they put God's name in the letters. There was the YHWH, Yod He Vahe, is how you say God's name. They don't have a vowel, so that's why they have the YHWH. And it's interesting when biblical historians began to study the Bible, they began to try and figure out how to pronounce God's name, and nobody knew. Because the Hebrew would put the vowel, they put the consonants as the main part, but they'd have marks to let you know what the vowels were in that spot. The problem was the name for Yahweh, or what we assume to be Yahweh, the name for God, didn't have those marks. And what would happen is the Israelites did this because they thought that this commandment said, don't take the name of the Lord God in vain. So therefore, they said that to keep us from taking his name in vain, we're just going to forget his name. We're not going to know how to pronounce his name. And therefore, we cannot break this commandment. Again, that's not a bad thing to do, not a horrible thing, but I don't think that was God's intention, this commandment. And what they would do, now this is how far they went, what they would do is when they would get to their synagogues and their worship centers, the temple, and they would read scripture, when they came across the name of God, of Yod He Vahe, they would not pronounce that name. They would put in another name in its place. They'd usually put in a reading in the synagogue, they would say Adonai, which means my Lord. And that's where the English translations have picked up, because if you notice your English translation will have the name Lord. And when this happens, and there are places when Lord is used that form, but usually, and we've said this before, if your Bible has the word Lord in all capital letters, smaller capital letters, that is a sign that what that word is the name of God. But what did God mean here? That's two ideas. Some people say don't use it curses, and some people say we don't even know his name at all. But what does God mean here? I think what God is talking about here is God's talking about in oaths. He's talking, don't use his name falsely in oaths, meaning don't swear to God you're going to do something and then fall through with it. And the problem with that is that this is a common practice in their world. Is one thing you do is you swear by your God. You would swear by your God that you're going to fulfill your end of the bargain. Well, if you didn't keep up your end of the bargain, that looked bad on your God. And for the pagans, okay, they look bad on their God, but what is their God going to do? Their God that's not a God, that's not got any power, he's not going to do anything to them, so they could pull this off. But God says, you're not going to do that. If you use my name, he says, you're going to mean it. It's going to have, it's going to be a powerful standing name, going to hold you guilty of it. And therefore, do not swear in my name. Do not take the Lord's God in the name of the Lord your God in vain. Basically, what he's saying is, don't swear by my name if you don't intend to keep that covenant, that promise. And again, he says, for I will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. One who breaks his oath, he says, you're going to pay for it. You're going to be held in contempt. You're going to be held in a bad position if you take this name wrongly. So that's the third commandment. The fourth commandment is remember the Sabbath day. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is with you in the gate, who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So here he says, remember the Sabbath, keep the Sabbath. Now, we're going to notice, so we talked about this a few weeks ago, it's not until about Exodus 16 that God told the Israelites about keeping the Sabbath. Remember when he told them to gather manna, remember he told them on what we call Friday, the sixth day, he says, gather double. That one day you can gather double. Other than that, you are just supposed to gather enough for one day. Remember, he said you gathered double on that last day so that on the Sabbath you would not have to collect any and it wouldn't go bad. And that was the introduction of the Sabbath. And here we talked about there, we're going to talk about again here. God again sets forth this Sabbath day as a day of rest. And again, the Sabbath day is a day that's to be set apart. That's the idea of holy. Keep it holy, keep it set apart, keep it different. And then he lays out the plan. For 6 days you'll work, and on the seventh day you'll rest. Now, some people will still say today, I've talked to some people who still say, well, I think Sunday is our Sabbath day. And therefore I think it's wrong to do any work on the Sabbath day or on Sunday. And I've known some people who still, there's groups that still teach that the Sabbath day is a holy day, that is a day of worship. Well, the problem with those ideas is that when God laid out, and the problem with that idea is that the people who say that will say that the Sabbath day was a day that was created or was in practice to be set apart for rest since the beginning. God talks about the Sabbath as being the holy day, the day of rest, but nowhere in Genesis, nowhere in the first part of Exodus, we hear any kind of idea about resting on the Sabbath day. Matter of fact, for 400 years, when the Jews were slaves in Egypt, they didn't have the Sabbath day off. There was no observance of a Sabbath day, of holy day, a restful day, recorded anywhere in any scriptures before Exodus 20. And the other flip side of this is that people will talk about this, the Sabbath day as being, God set it up as a day of worship. The Sabbath day, as originally intended here, is not listed as a day of worship. Notice there's no mention here at all about worship on the Sabbath. It was just a day of rest, a day to stop. There was to be times of worship, but it didn't necessarily have to be the Sabbath day. It's not until actually after the kings, the Babylonian captivity, and around the Babylonian captivity, and after that, when the Jews began to meet in synagogues, that they began to take the Sabbath day and treat it as a day of worship. It is not until, again, hundreds of years after the Ten Commandments and the law that they began to treat the Sabbath day as a holy day, or not a holy day, but a day of worship. So again, those who try to honor and say we still have to keep the Sabbath is missing the point. I think this is a day that was designated in their time, a day designated for the Israelites and no one else. It was a day they were to rest. And again, I think this is a very important thing that people have, and people have realized, to have a day of rest. God rested from his work, therefore man needs to rest from his work. Because if a man doesn't rest from his work, he's going to be consumed by that work, and it's going to cause him problems. So those are the first four commandments. The first four commandments are summed up with the idea that these commandments deal with the man's relationship to God. You'll remember, and I say that to bring up this point, you remember in the New Testament, Jesus asked the question, and he asked the lawyer a question of what is the greatest commandment. You remember they always say to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and spirit. And they'll talk about that's the first commandment. Then the second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, the Jews at Jesus' time had devised those two verses as a summation of the Ten Commandments. Love the Lord your God with your whole being was a summation of these first four. Have no other gods, no graven image, remember the Sabbath day, and it just left me. I apologize. Not take the Lord your God's name in vain. I apologize for that. I should know that. But that was the idea. Those first four commandments dealt with God, man's relationship with God. And then remember the second greatest commandment, I said a minute ago, was love your neighbor as yourself. Well, commandments 5 through 10, the next 6 deal with man's relationship to man. And so we continue to look at that. The first one here is honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So he tells them to honor their father and mother. And this honoring means they obeyed, they followed, they respected. They didn't argue, didn't yell, didn't hit, didn't fight with their parents. This was what we're going to see. We're going to see this fleshed out a little later in this law. God's going to lay out how they're to honor their father and mother. And then we find out in the New Testament, even more easily portrayed, that this honor your father and mother carried on into your adult life, in that the children were responsible for their parents. As the parents got older and were unable to work, it was the children's responsibility to take care of that parent. And that's where the problem of Corban comes up. We could say that, and we'll say that another time. But that was where the Jews had this idea that you could say that anything that my parents would give me is Corban. Basically, you pay a certain amount of money to the temple, and you didn't have to take care of your parents. And Jesus says, no, that violates God's law. That violates God's commandment to honor your father and mother. Now, the other interesting thing about this is that this is the commandment that Paul says in Ephesians 6 is one that's given with a promise that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And Paul will say again, this part applies to us, that we have long days again. Now, this does not mean this is an absolute. Now, there's certain times in the Bible and certain things in the Bible, like the Proverbs will do this, that these statements are not necessarily absolute truths. What I mean by absolute truth is this is right no matter what, that this is never going to be broken. Well, there are going to be things that they're not going to follow this. Now, meaning there's going to be kids, there's going to be children, there's going to be teenagers, there's going to be young adults who honored their father and mother and listened to them, but they died at a young age. May have died in an accident, may have died by some strange circumstance. But the idea is, a general rule is they're going to live long in the land. Well, why? Well, there's a few common sense applications. One is they're going to live long because God has promised it. But two, they're going to live long because they know how to respect authority. You see, that's one of the things that we're seeing in our culture, and I don't want to get into culture too much, but one of the things we've noticed in our culture, and I think we've all noticed it, especially the older ones, of how little children and young kids respect their parents, and that has flooded over into the respect of authority. You look at the world around us, how little authority is respected anymore, how little people in power are given any credit. Well, why? Well, part of that goes back down to that they're not learning about honoring those in authority. The number one people in authority in your life is your parents. So God knew that in order for his people to honor him, to treat him, to live for him, to do what he's called them to do, they have to honor their father and mother. And if they honor their father and mother, they'll learn about respecting authority. And so this is a very important promise. And the idea is that they honor their father and mother. They'll honor the authority. They'll obey the authority. They won't be arrested. They won't be tried. They won't be put to death. And therefore, they'll live a long life in the land. Again, as a general rule, generally, this is what will happen. But that's the fifth commandment. The sixth commandment, a very short one: you shall not murder. Now, I want to point one thing out here. The word in Hebrew here is murder. The King James translate this as kill. And the problem with that, one of the issues some people have with that is when you translate this as you shall not kill, they say, okay, what are we going to do? How do we address this? Because if God says you shall not kill, but then later God's going to tell Israel to go to war. Well, what's going to happen in war? You're going to kill people. Does that mean that those soldiers who go to war and kill someone is guilty of breaking the law, even though they obey God's command to go out and go to war? Or the executioner who's told to put people to death? And the people who take part in the stoning of people, does that mean that they're going to be guilty of breaking this law, and therefore they're guilty of breaking God's law because they're keeping God's law in another place? That's part of the problem with you shall not kill is there's that general word kill, because kill can mean very, very different things. The word in Hebrew is a word that means murder. And what it means is it means premeditated murder. It means of a jealous rivalry. Is the word used, I believe, to describe Cain and Abel. And we're going to see that later God's going to give some exceptions to this. If a man kills another accidentally, that man can flee to a city of refuge till the truth is found out. But if anyone kills and murders, with the intent to kill because of personal rivalry or revenge or jealousy, then they are breaking this command. The next one is you shall not commit adultery. So not only deal with the relationship between man and man, or the man and his fellow man, we also deal with the idea of marriages. And again, this is another part that our culture, our world is seeing fall apart. Because adultery has become a very commonplace in our society, and with that has led to divorce. And again, just how common this has become. And God laid out for his people, don't commit adultery. Why? Well, that's to solidify the marriage. That's to solidify. And the idea of adultery is to have an illicit sexual relation with someone other than your partner. To have relations with someone other than your spouse. And that is the adultery. And God says you shall not commit adultery. And so God lays out this plan. And again, this is a plan. This is a law that is unheard of in this time. Now, murder was, we understand that, but this law was another law that other cultures didn't necessarily apply very well. And again, they're like us. They didn't apply that. Well, why? Well, because they liked adultery. They liked the idea that they could go and sleep with whoever they wanted to and go and have all these relationships and not have anything to worry about. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? They also had temples. This is the thing about the pagans. They had temples where part of your worship to your God was to have sex with a temple prostitute. And even if you were married, that was your way of worshiping. Even the women would have these temples. They could go worship with men that way. And so God lays out this very simple thing that don't commit adultery. Don't have these relations outside the marriage. And this solidifies that the marriage was a very important thing of God. And we've said that from the beginning. When that was one of the first covenants God set forth, was that a man shall be joined to his wife, and they shall leave father and mother, and be joined together and create a new child or create a new body, a new flesh. And so this is that foundation of how important that is. And God's going to lay out some commands, again, later on, about how to deal with adultery. And we're going to see that God didn't pander with adultery. God didn't sweep it under the rug. God was very peculiar in what he said. From there, we go to next one, verse 15, you shall not steal. And again, this is the idea that you shall not take another's property. Don't take what belongs to someone else. Now, this teaches a very important concept, again, that one that people need to be reminded of today, especially when you think about the way some people try to take about the church and first century. Some people would try to take Acts 2 and talk about how the church shared all they had, and they had all things in common, and they try to take that and say, oh, well, that means the church ought to be a communist type society, that we have nothing of our own, but we just give to each other, and we just all live together and be happy. This commandment doesn't specify that. This commandment, again, is negative, but it teaches a positive, and that is that people are able to have possessions. People are able to have possessions that are their possessions, that belong to them and no one else. Because God says you shall not steal. There are things that, again, God lays out that you work for, you earn, that are yours. And it is wrong, sinful if someone come take that from you. So this is a very important idea, a concept we may miss because we don't think about it in what it teaches by the opposite of what it says. That this says it's okay to have things. And again, some people may not have a problem with that, but then there may be some that haven't thought about that way that need to realize that. From there we go to the next one. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now, this false witness goes beyond just lying. Again, lying is not lying is condemned here. It is included in this, but lying is not the major focus here. This is bearing false witness in a court case. This is why God will lay forth the command a little later, and we talk about this in New Testament, where God says, based on the witness of two or three, or the testimony of two or three witnesses. That's a pattern. Two or three witnesses are to be given for any case, any criminal case. There were to be two or three witnesses give their testimony, not just one. Well, why? Well, if you think about it, I can come and tell somebody, I can tell the police down here that you did whatever I want them to do. Whatever, if I'm mad at you and upset with you, I can go tell them that you stole from me. You killed this person. You did this. And it's my word against yours. And I can be very biased of what I say. However, if there's two or three witnesses, then it's a lot harder to get a lie out. It's a lot harder for the truth not to be given. And therefore, why God says have two or three witnesses. And this law is given because, again, in their time, they didn't have the things we have. We cut on TV and we watch these crime shows where they spend the whole hour and they find all this evidence. They find DNA. They find these physical evidence, and they have fingerprints. They do all these various things to figure out who did this. And we love those shows as a society to figure out who did it. Well, in their time, you didn't have that kind of evidence. You didn't have those kind of findings. So you depended on the witness. And God says in his law, he says, look, you've got to be a good witness. You cannot bear false witness because you can cause someone bodily harm, physical or financial harm, reputational harm if you don't bear good witness. And then we go to the last one. And this is the idea again of being with their neighbor. And he says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male servant, his female servant, his ox, his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. And this is the idea of covet, is the idea of desire so much that you will do anything it takes to get it. You'll take anything it takes to get it from your neighbor. Now, again, we just saw a minute ago that the commandment, do not steal. God's not against us having a house. God's not against us having these things. God's not against us having possessions. God doesn't want us to be driven by possessions. God doesn't want us to be driven by things and driven in a way that we're jealous of our neighbor and we covet what our neighbor has. And again, the idea we're going to see later, our New Testament, Paul will lay out and tell us that coveting is a form of idolatry. That to covet is to be idolatrous, and that you put another God, that thing you're coveting is a God for you. And so he says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. And then he gives God gives a descending order of what is important in a neighbor's house. Notice the neighbor, again, his things, so the man of the house, there's his wife, and it'll be his wife and his children, his male servant, his female servant, his ox, his donkey, anything that is yours. And what this does is this shows us again that although there were slaves there, the slaves held a very high position. They were above the animals. They were above the possessions. God put them in a very important place. They were a little lower than the family, but they weren't treated like the scum of the earth, that they would just be thrown away and tossed aside. And so God speaks these 10 words. God gives these 10 commandments to the people. And we pick back up in verse 18 to get back to the narrative. And in verse 18, Moses says, now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off and said to Moses, you speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us lest we die. Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. The people stood far off while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. So God speaks to Moses from the cloud. He speaks from the mountain, and the entire nation of Israel hears it. After he gives the 10 commandments, Moses comes back to the people, and the people see all that God is doing, the way he's exhibited himself, the thunder, the lightning, the trumpet, the mountain smoking, and the people are afraid. The people are scared to death. And this is one of the interesting verses to me in the entire Bible. Sometimes people talk about, well, God spoke to me. I heard God say this. I don't know if we hear God speak. We can talk about that verse, but the way these people react to God speaking, I don't think God speaks as easily and as peacefully as some people think he does. Because God has spoken to these people, and these people come to Moses and they say, Moses, we're afraid. Moses, we don't like listening to God. God scares us. If we listen to God, notice, if we listen to God more, God's going to kill us. He's going to kill us. So here's what we say. You go speak to God. You go talk to God. And then you come tell us what God said. You see what the people have done. They've just asked Moses to do what God has told them to do, or God told Moses to do from the beginning. And that God told Moses, you will be my spokesman. You will go and you will speak to these people. What I tell you, you'll be my mouthpiece. You'll be my prophet. Now the people said, Moses, we don't want to listen to God. We want to listen to you. And again, that's the idea. They don't want to listen to the mouth of God. They're afraid of what God has said. And Moses comes up and he tells them, look, don't be afraid. Don't fear. Don't think God's going to kill you. He said, but realize God's come to test you. God wants you to see, to know who he is. Now, the sad thing about this realization, and we'll give this away because we're going to see in a few weeks that when we get to chapter 30, the people forget how fearsome God is when they begin to worship that golden calf. But God said, Moses says, no, God's come to test you, to try you, to make sure you realize who he really is. And that fear that he has given you should cause you, to be his faithful child, to be his faithful servant, to serve him and to listen to these laws and know that what he said, he is true, and what he says he'll do, he'll do. And then you notice verse 21, the people stand afar off. The people back up. They go back to their lives. And Moses goes back to the darkness. Moses goes back to God to listen to him. And then real quickly, we're going to notice these last few verses of what God's going to tell Moses, because in the beginning of verse 22 of chapter 20 and going through pretty much the end of Exodus, God's going to give the covenant to Moses. This is where the law really begins. The Ten Commandments are the beginning of the law, the basic breakdown of that law. Now God's going to get into the specifics. He's going to talk about some altars tonight. And we're going to talk about these. This should take just a few minutes. We'll be done. Verse 22, the Lord said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, you have seen for yourselves that I have taught with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourself gods of gold. An altar of earth you shall make for me, and sacrifice on it burnt offerings, and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone. For if you would wield your tool on it, you profane it. And you shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness may not be exposed on it." Notice what God says here. God tells the people, again, he reminds Moses, this is building on those first commandments. That's where he goes back to. God's going to go back in this law. He's going to build on those 10 commandments. He's going to build on the application, the practical way of doing this. Where again, he says, you have seen that I've taught to you from heaven. And he says, don't make these gods of silver, nor gods of gold to put with me, to try to say they're with me, to worship alongside of me, or to say this is who I am. This is not who I am. And then he talks about worshiping him on altars. Now, we're going to see that these altars were altars that were built and have been built throughout Old Testament history. What this is, these are altars that are used outside the altar of the burnt offering, the altar of burnt offering in the tabernacle and in the temple. These are offerings and things where they're supposed to be offered in other places beside those. We'll see some of these as they travel. They'll build these altars where they're going to offer on. When Elijah builds the altar on the Mount Carmel, he follows this pattern. God talks about these altars. He talks about two different kinds. One is the altar of earth. If you make an altar of earth, this is basically just dirt that's piled up in a pile. You're gonna sacrifice on it your peace offerings, so your burnt offerings, and this was the offerings that were burnt. A burnt offering, you burnt the entire offering. God, a peace offering was a peace with you and God, and the Levites who would offer this offering, there'd be a piece of the meat that'll be left over. A piece would go to the Levites, and another piece would go to the people, and they were to sit and eat that meat, and they were basically partaking of that offering with God to show their peace with God. And so God says that you're gonna make an altar of earth that you're going to build here, not an altar. And the idea is not an altar of built thing or of other materials. Again, in every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. God says you're going to build these altars where I am, where I come to you, when I'm with you. And then in verse 25, he gives a very interesting idea about these altars of stone. We see these altars of stone. We've seen them before. But this is one thing you're going to do. He says, when you build an altar of stone, he says, do not make it out of hewn stone. Don't make it out of cut stone. No tool shall be used on these stones. Basically, what you're to do is take stones that are natural and place them on top of each other to build this altar. And again, the altar would have been a box, an outer edge with the inside is empty, where you'd pile it full of wood, and then you'd burn it, and you put the wood there, you put the animal on top of it, you're sacrificing, you'd light it on fire. But God says, don't use any carved stone, because if you carved the stone, he says you profaned it. Well, why? Again, we really don't know, but God's just saying use what's already there. Use the natural stone. Don't try to, and I think the idea is don't make it decorative. Don't make this an altar that you come to see the altar, not what's on the altar, not to use it for its right purpose. And then finally, verse 26 is sort of one of the interesting ones to me when I figured out what this was about. God says, don't make an altar that you have to go up by steps. Basically, don't build an altar up high where people will have to watch you go up. Well, he has a very practical reason for it. He said, because if you had to go up, remember, they wore robes and they had their undergarments underneath. And again, they didn't have the undergarments we had. And so he says, don't climb steps where your undergarments, your nakedness may be exposed. If you expose your nakedness, he says, you ruined the altar. You've ruined the offering. And so God gives some very practical ideas that when you offer offerings to him, the basic idea is we offer an offering to God. The altar is not the focus of the worship. It's what is on that altar and what has been offered. And so this is that first introduction into the covenant, into what God has done. And so we're going to see, I know this week we took a little longer than we used to do, but I want to cover these 10 commandments and really look at them. And that's going to be our basis for what we're going to be for the next few weeks. And again, next few weeks, we're probably going to go a little quicker than we have been. Hopefully, I don't know, I may get bogged down, but we'll see. We should be able to cover a little more ground because we're going to talk about the basic idea of what these laws were about and what these laws taught people. And that's what we're going to see. These laws were not just religious laws. These were civil laws. These were laws of death penalty, of crimes, how to run a government. There are a lot of things that God's going to lay out in these coming chapters that are very important for us to understand the background, but to understand how Israel was supposed to work. And Israel typically did these things, but there were some of these Israel didn't follow. But for tonight, we're going to stop right there. I appreciate everyone joining us here tonight. I appreciate you watching us. Remember, we have our Sunday morning worship, 10 a.m. At the church building. If you're able, we'd love to have you come out and see us. If not, remember we do that on Facebook and YouTube. Remember also, we have started our FBI class. If you would like to watch that, you can find it on our Church of Christ page, also our member group. You can find it on my personal page. You can also find it on our YouTube page and as well as our Facebook group for FBI. We're going to be studying the Old Testament. So if you get a chance to do that, I encourage you to do that. Again, remember those we mentioned sick. I know we got quite a few in our congregation that are not well. So remember them in your prayers. We hope everyone's staying safe. We look forward to seeing you all soon. But for tonight, we are finished, and we hope that you have a